All right, we've covered lots of things this quarter. We've started with solving systems of equations by graphing. We've used solving system of equations by substitution. We solve systems of equations with elimination, and then we have multiplied polynomials. So we've done quite a bit so far in third quarter, and we've got one more topic to cover, and that's called factoring. So it will be another mini unit. We're probably going to spend about 2 weeks on it. Then we'll have a test. Then you're all done with quarter 3. So let's start with factoring. So in our previous unit, we learned how to multiply polynomials. That's what we did last time. We distributed a bunch of things. We had the box method. In this unit, what factoring is we're just going to be going backwards. So instead of distributing, we're just going to be doing the opposite of distributing. And that's going to be a process called factoring. And there's a bunch of different methods and ways to approach factoring. It completely depends on what the problem is giving to you. But we're going to focus this one on what's called the greatest common factor, the GCF, greatest common factor. We're looking for the biggest thing, the greatest, that they have in common, common factor. So the biggest thing they have in common. And let's start with a couple examples. Identify the greatest common factor between the numbers 20 and 25. So here's how I do this. I look at all the factor pairs of 20. So let's look at all the things that could possibly multiply to make it 20. You got 1 times 20. That makes 20. You've got 2 times 10. That would make 20. And you also have 4 and 5. 4 times 5 makes 20. All of these numbers here could multiply evenly into a 20. Now let's look at the 25. You could have 1 and 25. 2 doesn't work, 3 doesn't work, 4 doesn't work, but you could have 5 and 5. And then there's no more. So what we're looking for is the greatest common factor. Well, you'll notice they have a 1 in common, okay, but they also have a 5 in common. So those are the 2 different factor pairs they have in common. Which one of those is the greatest? 5 is the greatest. So your greatest common factor would be 5. Let's see what happens when we deal with some variables here. We have x to the 8th, x to the 6th, and x to the 5th. What is the greatest common factor among these? Well, let's remember that x to the 8th is just x being multiplied by itself 8 times. X to the 6th is just x being multiplied by itself 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. And x to the 5th is x being multiplied by itself 5 times. So I want to look at this, and what do they have in common? Well, they have all of these in common. So this one had x to the 5th, this one had x to the 5th, this one had an x to the 5th. They all had an x to the 5th in common. That is your greatest common factor. And you'll notice there's some left over. We're going to show you what to do with that leftover stuff in a bit. All right, now we're going to make it a little bit more complicated where we have some numbers and some variables, and then we're also going to put a third number in there. So 24x to the 5th, 30x to the 4th, and 12x to the 3rd. What I like to do is I like to look at the smallest number. So 12 is our smallest number here. And we're going to look at all the factors of 12. So you could have 1 and 12. You could have 2 and 6. And you could have 3 and 4. And I want to see which of these numbers does the 24 and the 30 also have in common. And we're going to try and find the biggest one that they have in common. I'm going to start with the 12. If I look at the 12, does 12 go into 24 evenly? Yes, because 12 times 2, 24. That's good. Does the 12 go into 30 easily? No. 12 times 2 is 24, but 12 times 3 is 36, so it does not divide evenly with that 30, so it's not going to be 12. Let's move on to the next one, which is a 6. Does 6 go into 24 evenly? Yeah, because 6 times 4, 24. Does 6 go into 30 evenly? Yes, because 6 times 5 is 30. And 6 definitely goes into 12, because that's what we determined earlier. So our greatest common factor, in this case, would have the number 6 in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite each of these with a 6 in there. So 24 is the same as 4 times 6, and then the x to the 5th is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 x's. The 30x to the 4th is 5 times 6, 30 is 5 times 6, and x to the 4th. And 12x to the 3rd, 12 is just 2 times 6, and then x to the 3rd. So what I did is I just rewrote all of them with my greatest common factor in there. My 6 is in there. And then I wrote out all of the x's as well. And if we identified what they have in common, they all have a 6 in common, and they all have an x to the 3rd in common. So your greatest common factor would be 6x to the 3rd. So we want to get really good at identifying the greatest common factor before we start factoring. So go ahead and try the next 3 on your own. You're going to pause the video now, and when you are all done, come on back. All right, we're going to move on to a couple examples here where we're going to take out the greatest common factor. So we're going to be factoring this. And we're going to start out by just taking out the number, and then later on in the examples, we'll make it more difficult and include the variables as well. But for the first one, what I like to do is I look at 10x squared. So I'm going to look at the 10. I'm going to look at the 5, and I'm going to look at the 30. And I want to know what number do they all have in common. So what I do is I look at the smallest number, which is 5, and the only things that multiply to make 5 are 1 and 5. That makes this one pretty easy. 5 is a prime number. So I'm going to look at the biggest number first, 5. Does 5 go into 10? Yes. Does 5 go into 5? Yes. Does 5 go into 30? Yes. So my greatest common factor is a 5. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite each of these with a 5 in there. So that 10x squared, I can rewrite it as 2 times 5 x squared. That negative 5, careful on this one, this is like a negative 1 times 5 with an x. And 30 can be rewritten as 6 times 5. So all I did is I rewrote all of these with a 5 in there. Now what we have to do is we have to identify what they have in common, and what they all have in common is this 5. So our 5 is what's called our greatest common factor, and here's how we do the rest of it. We're going to put the 5 out here. Remember how I said this is like the opposite of distributing? So now we're going to put the 5 outside the parentheses, and then we look at what's remaining. So if I look at that first term, I have 2x squared remaining. 2x squared. If I look at the middle term, I have a negative 1x remaining. And I don't write the 1 in there. And the last one, I still have a positive 6. And this is how you factor out the greatest common factor. One really nice thing about this is you can just distribute and check your answer. So 5 times 2x squared is 10x squared. 5 times negative x is minus 5x. And 5 times 6 is 30. So you can always just redistribute your answer, and you should get the same thing. Let's do one more example together, at least with numbers. So I'm going to look at the smallest number, that's the 16, and I'm going to list out the factor pairs. 1 and 16, 2 and 8, and 4 and 4. Let's start with 16. Does 16 go into 22 evenly? No, doesn't work. Let's go to the 8. Does 8 go into 22 evenly? No, doesn't work. Let's go to the 4. Does 4 go into 22 evenly? No, doesn't work. That 4 won't work either. And let's go to that 2. Does 2 go into 22 evenly? Yes, it does. They're all even numbers, so they all have a factor of 2 in there. So let's rewrite all of these with a 2 in there. The first one would be 11 times 2, x squared. The other one would be 8 times 2 times an x. And the other one would be negative 10 times 2. So we took each of these terms and rewrote them with a factor of 2 in there. Then we look for what they have in common. They all have this 2 in common. That's what gets taken outside. So we put a 2 on the outside of the parentheses, and we look at what's left. Over here, we're left with 11x squared. Over here, we are left with an 8x. And here we are left with minus 10. And that is your final factored answer. So go ahead and practice on the next row, see how you do, and then come on back, we'll add some variables. All right, welcome back. We are now going to add some variables into this. The process will still be the exact same. So I'm going to look at the smallest number, that 18, and I'm going to list out the factors of 18. 1 and 18, 2 and 9, 3 and 6. And in the interest of time, I'm going to jump to the right one. 6 will be the number that they have in common. So I'm going to rewrite all of these with a 6 in there. So we're going to rewrite 18 as 3 times 6. Now you see that x to the 6th, that's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 x's. Now I go to the 24x to the 4th. That's the same as 4 times 6, x to the 4th. Then I go to that 30x squared. That's the same as 5 times 6, x squared. Now what I want to do is I want to look at what they all have in common. Well, they all have a 6 in common, but you'll notice, this is why this one's a little different, they also have an x squared in common. All of them have at least 2 x's that you could take away. So our greatest common factor is going to be 6x squared, and that gets taken outside of the parentheses. Then we look at what's remaining. On the top row, we have 3x to the 4th. In the middle term, we're left with 4x squared. And on the bottom, we still have plus 5. And once again, the nice thing about this process is after you're done, you can always check your answer. You could take 6x squared and multiply it by 3x to the 4th, and it gives you 18x to the 6th. And you could do that for each term, and it should match up. All right, one more. And for this one, I think it's maybe kind of obvious. You look at all of these, they all have a 0 at the end of it. You could divide each of these by a 10. So I won't go through all of the factor pairs, but 10 is a number that they're all going to have in common. And in this case, it will be the greatest common factor. So we write the first one as 4 times 10, x to the 9th. Next one is going to be negative 3 times 10, x to the 6th. And the last one is negative 7 times 10, x to the 3rd. So if we ask what's the greatest common factor, well, they all have a 10, and they all have x to the 3rd. So I'm going to put 10x to the 3rd as my greatest common factor. That goes outside the parentheses. And then we look at what's left. On the top, we have 4x to the 6th. In that middle row, we have minus 3x to the 3rd. And in the last one, we have minus 7. And that is factoring by the greatest common factor. You probably want your password. The password for this will be, we'll put a lowercase, C-O-C-O-N-U-T, coconut. I'm drinking this by drink, coconut water. So there's your password, coconut. Come on back in the next video, and we're learning about factoring trinomials into 2 binomials. Exciting stuff.